the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network presents Vatican Insider with Joan Lewis. Each week, Joan brings you news from inside the Vatican and the Church around the world, as well as interviews and answers to your questions. Now, here's the host of Vatican Insider, Joan Lewis.
Welcome to Vatican Insider. I just wanted to tell you I'll be away for a bit on vacation, but my terrific colleagues and friends at EWTN Radio will be preparing a Best Of series in my absence. So sit back this weekend and enjoy a special listening adventure. Well, I want to say welcome once again to all the listeners of Vatican Insider, and I'm with Samuel Gregg, my guest this week. He's the research director at the Acton Institute in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and he's in Rome for the presentation of his latest book. And the mission of Acton really is to promote a free and virtuous society characterized by individual liberty and sustained by religious principles. So, Sam, welcome to Vatican Insider.
Sure. Thank you for having me here. It's great to be on with you.
A little bit about Sam's background. With multiple degrees in political philosophy, moral philosophy, and political economy, Gregg has written extensively on questions of political economy, economic history, ethics and finance, and natural law theory, your specialty really. Among his books, Morality, Law, and Public Policy, and one I would love to read, Economic Thinking for the Theologically Minded. So we're actually here to talk about your latest book, Reason, Faith, and the Struggle for Western Civilization. Now, early on in the book, you write that one argument of this book is that not only can reason and faith correct each other's excesses, they can also enhance each other's comprehension of the truth, continually renewing Western civilization. So we're talking about them working together, not in the beginning, not being separated. So talk about that for a moment.
Well, one of the things I argue in the book is that Christianity developed a particular integration of reason and faith, which is very important for understanding how the West developed as a culture and as a civilization. And one of the reasons for this is the particular understanding of the nature of God that Christianity articulates. And we in Christian terms, we talk of God as love, we talk of God as mercy, but in Christian terms, we also talk about God as divine reason. And the Greek word that was used to describe this facet of God's nature, which, by the way, is also used in the first line of the Gospel of John, is logos. Logos means divine reason. It's a Greek word that meant at least 14 different things when the Greeks were using it, but thanks to Christianity, it acquired this particular meaning of divine reason. And this is very important because what it tells us is that God is not pure will, God is not emotion, God is not all these things, but God has this very distinct characteristic of reasonability. And this is important because not every religion understands God that way. Other religions have an understanding of God as pure will, for example. But because Christianity had this particular understanding of reason and faith, reflecting this nature of God himself as the Logos, the divine reason, it shaped Western culture in particular ways. I don't think it's a mistake that you find the rise of the universities, for example, in the context of Christian culture, because Christianity has always taken reason very, very seriously. This is very important for our own time, because I think in many cases there are many Christians, including some Catholics, who tend to view God in primarily in terms of feelings, of emotions, of sentiment. Now, as I said, God is clearly love, and emotions and feelings are very important. But if we lose a sense of God as divine reason, of God's reasonability, then I think we start to lose something of the nature of the truth of God, and we start to lose a certain understanding of ourselves, not just ourselves as in terms of the culture of the West, but ourselves as human beings, who one of the things that makes us different from all other animals is, of course, the fact that we have reason. No other being has this. And Christianity talks about this right from the very beginning. St. Paul talks about this in his letters. The long tradition of the Church Fathers, all the way through to Albertus Magnus, Thomas Aquinas, and into our own time with people like John Paul II and Benedict XVI. They've all talked about this dimension of faith and reason. And the problem, of course, is that when that integration breaks down, we start to see major problems in the culture of the West. And I would argue that if we want to understand some of the dysfunctionalities that characterize much of our culture today, this breakdown of this close integration of reason and faith has much to do with that.
Well, you also say that reason and faith need not be locked in an endless struggle for supremacy, from which I therefore gathered that it's more important to work together than have one of them be supreme. So is this part of the basic premise of the book?
Yes, because the tradition in some circles, in some Western philosophical and even some Western theological circles, has been to see reason and faith as being fundamentally different. So, I am a person of reason, therefore I do not believe. Or, I am a person of faith, therefore I do not take reason seriously. And, of course, that is not how Christianity understands the relationship between these things. And it's not, I should add, a question of balance. It's a question of these two things naturally reinforcing each other. So, for example, we need reason to explain certain facets of the nature of God, to explain certain dimensions of Christian doctrine, etc. That's a way in which reason complements the workings of faith. But faith also informs reason, because faith tells us that there are things that are beyond reason, that there are things we can't completely understand through reason. Even if reason does give us a sense that certain things are a certain way, we need faith to remind us that there are these things that are beyond us as human beings. That doesn't make them less true than anything else. All it means is that reason needs to be guided by some of the deeper revelation that we find in the person of Jesus Christ. So these are examples of whereby reason and faith complement and reinforce and shape each other. Now, of course, it's a very difficult integration to keep together, because the tendency is always to emphasize one at the expense of the other. And that's usually when we start to get ourselves in philosophical, theological, and even political difficulties.
Oh, absolutely. Now, you've studied both faith and reason through the millennia. Just of the parts of the book, not all of it that I read, Romans, Greeks, Jews, Christians, the Enlightenment, actually several Enlightenments as I learned today, Progressivism, Aquinas, Newton, Benedict XVI, and the Jesuit father Samir Khalil Samir, whom I do know and have interviewed. What an amazing man, you know. And so countless others. And you note, quote, "We'll see how the West's unique integration of reason and faith, specifically Jewish and Christian faith, encouraged the ideas, commitment, and institutions that gave the West its core identity." And I know defining the West was certainly part of the meeting a lot of us had with you earlier today.
Well, what's interesting about this is that if you want to write about any culture, not just Western culture, but Islamic culture, whatever it happens to be, you have to be clear about what you mean by that. Because if you're not clear what you mean by, say, Western civilization or Western culture, then it's all very vacuous. And one of the things I try and argue is that if you want to understand Western civilization, you need to understand that it's informed by a particular vision of God, not just any vision, but a particular vision that is essentially articulated by Judaism and then Christianity. This is God as love, but also God as reason, because that in turn gives rise to a particular understanding of human beings and human nature. What you understand God to be is going to shape the way you understand human beings, right? So if God is, part of his characteristics are reason, then we have reason. If God is free, then we are free. And so reasonability, I think, is part of the trajectory of Western civilization, this concern for knowing truth through reason that you find in the Greeks, that you find in the Romans, you find in Jewish thought, and you also find it obviously in Christianity. So there's that, but there's also freedom, this notion that freedom and a particular understanding of freedom, that freedom is not just about the capacity to make choices. It's also this notion that our freedom, our free will, is directed by a reason towards the truth, and that we acquire a higher form of freedom when we freely choose to do the good. So there's freedom in the sense of freedom from unreasonable coercion, that we have to make choices, that we have to exercise our will. but that freedom itself is directed to something higher. And that's a very distinctive characteristic of Western civilization. Now, I'm not saying that these things are absent, completely absent from other civilizations or cultures, because they're obviously not. But they have worked their way out in a particular way in the history of what I'm calling Western civilization that makes this civilization distinct and important, and not just relevant for people who live in the West, but people who are concerned about what it means to live a good life, what it means to be a truly human being.
Basically, then, it's the relation of reason and faith that has distinguished Western civilization and can lead also to its downfall or survival.
Yes, yes.
And then define for us, as you did earlier today, Western civilization, because I think there's a concept that is a wrong concept.
Well, as I said, I think Western civilization is, as I say in the book, strong integration of reason and faith, a particular understanding of God, a commitment to rational inquiry in terms of truth, and also this commitment to freedom, both freedom in the sense of freedom from unreasonable coercion, but also freedom in the sense of this pursuit of higher truths.
But also Western in the sense of geographical, not whereas I think the concept that most people have, if you say Western society, they're going to think of Western Europe,
of course,
and they're going to think of the United States, Canada, and that's that. However, by your definitions, there are certainly other places,
of course,
in the world that would be defined as Western.
Of course. As you mentioned, I was born in Australia.
Exactly.
Australia is not in Europe, it's not in North America, it's the exact opposite part of the world, but it's clearly a Western country. A country like Israel is clear. Anyone who's been there, it's a Western country.
Exactly.
If you go to a country like Lebanon, that's very much a Western country.
Yeah.
Even though both those countries are in the Middle East, they're clearly Western. Or if you go to Latin America, does anyone dispute that Chile is a Western country? So it's very important to think about the West in that way, because then you realize that the West is, certainly there's a geographical sense to it, but it clearly also goes beyond that geographical description that you just outlined. And that's very important, because it makes you realize that Western ideals are really universal in their application.
Mother Angelica had a simple goal when she began EWTN: to reach the world with the gospel message. EWTN News operates multiple global news services and digital platforms, along with news agencies in Spanish, Italian, French, Portuguese, Arabic, and German. We've never wavered from our mandate to proclaim the truth and majesty of the Catholic faith. Thank you for joining EWTN in this mission.
This is a Messy Family Minute with Mike and Alicia Hernan. As we prepare for the holiday season, we need to remember the importance of hosting. All of us need community, and having people in our home is a great way to make them feel loved and to experience a little bit of heaven, whether it's a huge party or just another couple.
But so many of us have hostess anxiety and feel like our home, our cooking, or our kids aren't good enough to be exposed to others. The reality is that we all need to practice hospitality, because this is an important part of being a Christian. We need to remember that being a host is not about you, it's about your guest. It's possible that our hesitation to have people over our houses is that we're focused on ourselves when we should be focused on giving to others.
Community is important. We need to be encouraged by other people and hear what God is doing in their lives. And it's also a great way for our kids to learn how to serve and be hospitable. Also, getting together is simply a fun way to celebrate this holy season. For more inspiration, visit us at messyfamilyminute.org.
Welcome back to Vatican Insider. Here's Joan Lewis.
Welcome to part 2 of my conversation with Samuel Gregg, Research Director at the Acton Institute in Grand Rapids, Michigan, as he was in Rome to talk about his latest book, Reason, Faith, and the Struggle for Western Civilization. I'm glad you came back to hear Sam talk more about how the genius of Western civilization is its unique synthesis of faith and reason. But today, that synthesis is under attack. From the East by radical Islam, faith without reason, and from within the West itself by aggressive secularism, reason without faith. The stakes are incalculably high. The naive and increasingly common assumption that reason and faith are incompatible is simply at odds with the facts of history. Now, I have to tell you, as I was reading the book, I loved The Emperor Speaks for several reasons. That was about Pope Benedict XVI's Regensburg address in 2006, and I was there. And I have to tell you, I wasn't at the address because I had been sent to Regensburg to cover the Mass in the morning. I'd gotten up at like 5 or something to cover the Mass, and then afterwards be around for various TV appearances. But I had to be back in Munich that night, so I was going to take a train at like 7. And I was in the press office at 5 o'clock gathering up things, and they had just come out with the Italian and the German version of the Holy Father's address that was the papal address heard around the world. What was so fascinating, I just picked up my copy of Italian. If you were a journalist who did not have those two languages, you were going to be in deep trouble because the English didn't come out till like the next morning. As I was running out of the press office with my Italian copy, there was an Italian journalist who shouted out in Italian, "Benedict hates Islam." All right? I know. So now...
Which is absurd.
Exactly. But the rest of the office picks up on that. People who can't read the two languages that come out, they're now, quote, unquote, relying on the counterparts who do speak some English to tell them what's happening. So that was not an auspicious beginning to the papal speech. And he was saying it almost at the same time that this fellow in the press office was shouting out that Benedict hated Islam. You know, he didn't hate Islam at all. In fact, that is not what his speech was about.
Right. If you read the text, clearly on one level, there is a type of challenge to the Islamic world. There's a type of challenge there. He's asking the question, do you take reason seriously? Because if you look, for example, at a lot of jihadist ideology, the notion of the concept of God that informs a lot of those forms of ideology is God is pure will. You must literally do whatever God tells you to do, no matter how unreasonable. Flying a plane into a building, blowing up, etc. So there's clearly a type of question being asked of the Islamic world there. Do you take reason seriously? So that's one. But if you read the whole speech, you realize that that's not the main purpose of the text. The main purpose of the text is to talk about the West. The audience is the West. If you read that text, you realize he's not primarily talking to the Islamic world. He's talking to us. He's talking to us. We who live in the West, we who identify ourselves as part of this long tradition of thought, practice, and institutions. And when you look at the text, he's pointing out that if you want to understand some of the terrible things that have happened in Western history, you need to understand that they reflect what he calls in different places pathologies of reason and pathologies of faith.
Right.
And pathologies of faith and reason inevitably emerge when you separate these two things out. So when you remove reason from faith, you end up with one of two things. You end up with either a type of fundamentalism, a type of fideism, which is you just do whatever you're told. You don't think. You
react more.
You just react. You just. It's a type of divine command, and you just obey. Or you end up with sentimentalism, because when you take reason out of the picture, then suddenly God is not reasonable anymore. He's like a soft teddy bear who just affirms you and feels for you and just tells you that there's nothing wrong, never judges you, never says that you maybe should be living your life in a different way. So that's an example. When you separate reason out from faith, you end up with either fideism or a type of sentimentalism. On the other side of the picture, when you take faith away from reason, you end up with things like what's called scientism. Scientism is when you think that the natural science is the only way you can understand the world. Or you end up with some very nasty ideologies. And I would argue, for example, that if you look at a philosophical position, an ideology like Marxism, it's clearly a pathology of faith. Marxism has a whole religious dimension to it. They have sacred books. They have prophets like Marx, Engels, etc. They have saints, Lenin's body being on public display. Che Guevara is seen as a sort of heroic saint-like martyr figure. You have a type of ecclesiastical structure called the Communist Party. You have a hierarchy. You have the orthodox and the heterodox, etc. And the more you look at it, the more you realize Marxism is a type of pseudo-religion. And this is what happens when reason and faith get separated. You end up ascribing religious-like dimensions and qualities and perspectives to a philosophical position.
Right. Now, Chapter 6 is called A Way Back. The book is 7 chapters, and it really is not a long read.
No.
You have to have a little bit of background in history and a few other things. However, it's a good read. Chapter 6 is A Way Back, and the first thing that occurred to me when I saw the title is From What to What?
Well, one of the things that is very characteristic of most books that are about Western culture, Western civilization, is that they fall into one of two categories for the most part. One is those who basically think that Western civilization was always terrible and we need to get rid of it. Then there are those who say, well, Western civilization was a great thing, but now it's basically done. It's finished. There's nothing we can do. That's not my position. Neither of those positions are my positions. I basically argue that if we want to rejuvenate Western culture, Western civilization, we have to go back to the sources. So that means going back to, obviously, Greek philosophy, Roman law, and the Jewish and Christian faiths. But that doesn't mean we try and replicate everything as it was 100 years ago, 500 years ago, because things have happened in the meantime. We've had things like the various enlightenments, and we can't pretend that those things didn't happen. So when I say a way back, it's partly about going back to the original sources that gave life to the West and asking ourselves, how much do our societies reflect these truths? But then also to say, as a part of that renewal process, how do we incorporate some of the genuine contributions made by different, for example, Enlightenment thinkers? For example, if you think about the United States was clearly influenced on different levels by different Enlightenment thinkers. We can't pretend that didn't happen. But it's also true that the American Enlightenment and the American founding were not anti-religious. They were not anti-Christian. Not at all, which is a very strong contrast with, for example, some of the French Enlightenment and certainly the latter parts of the French Revolution. So way back is not just about going back to sources, it's also about how do we go back and simultaneously incorporate some of the things that we've learnt in the meantime. Now that's a very difficult exercise, it's a very long-term exercise. You can't vote these things into existence, but it is something that I think that particularly Catholics have a lot to say about, precisely because Catholicism has always taken reason and faith very seriously. We've always said that reason is important, reason is valuable, reason is something that we can use to explicate the truths of the faith. It's also a way we can better understand the world that God has given us.
Right. Now, unfortunately, Sam, we're ending the near of our time, and you have appointments, etc. But interestingly enough, as I was preparing my questions, this is so fascinating. You start with the word logos, and you started this very conversation with that word, and it's a thread throughout the book. I know at one part there is not chaos, but there's logos. And then you end with logos. The West is lost or decline, however, is not inescapable. The free choice for logos, and thus for reason and faith, is never beyond us. The desire for truth, liberty, and justice is simply part of who we are. Mm-hmm. So, that logo seems to sum up what you said in the book.
Yes, and it's very important because it would be very easy for us to look around the world and say, everything's a mess, everything's a disaster, people are unhappy, people don't seem to have faith, they also don't seem to take reason seriously, etc. But I don't believe that decline is inevitable, because I do believe that if God is Logos, then we can't escape the promptings of reason. We can't escape the responsibilities of freedom, because that's simply built into our nature as a consequence of us being the image of the Logos himself. But that demands a choice, and it demands a choice not just in terms of sort of big political decisions, but how we live our lives. Do we tell our children, for example, that the Catholic faith is not a fideistic faith? It's a faith that takes reason seriously. God has given us reason so that we can better understand revelation, but so we can also explain the truths of the faith to other Catholics, to other Christians, and to those who are non-believers. And one of the things I also say in the book is that even if you are a non-believer, and we all know non-believers, and many of them are very good people, but even if you're a non-believer, you can accept that this theme of Logos is fundamental to the understanding of the West as it is. So even if you're a non-believer, you can take this idea very seriously, and you can see how integral it is to the West. Now, it might not bring you to personal faith, but it will certainly give you an understanding of just how important this particular conception of God is for the history and the development, and hopefully at some time in the future, a type of renewed flourishing of Western civilization.
So with faith and reason, we can be optimistic.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. What I should have said halfway through the interview is that if you have just joined us, we have been talking with, so I'll say it now at the end, Samuel Gregg, who's with the Acton Institute in the research department in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and helping out for a couple days here on a visit for his latest book, which we've been talking about, and here at the Acton office in Rome. So thank you for your time, because I know that you're pressed every single moment you're waking up to going back to bed. So thank you.
Thank you, Joan. It's great to be with you, and thank you for the listeners for being with us.
Well, God bless you. Thanks for tuning in to the Best of Vatican Insider while I'm on vacation. And thanks to my EWTN colleagues and their hard work in preparing this week's program. Come back next weekend for another special listening adventure.
For more information on these stories, or to check out Joan's blog and to ask her a question, go to EWTN.com. That's EWTN.com. Thanks for listening to Vatican Insider on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.